Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jen Molinsky, Senior Researcher at the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and I want to welcome you to today's talk on multidimensional housing insecurity. Today, we're fortunate to have Giselle Routhier with us to present her work. Giselle is Policy Director at Coalition for the Homeless in New York City and just completed her doctoral work at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. I've known Giselle for a number of years now and had the pleasure of serving on her doctoral committee. The work she'll talk about today is drawn from 2 of her 3 dissertation papers, one of which has already been published in Housing Policy Debate, and one of my colleagues will put the link for that in the chat in a moment. I'm delighted she's here today to share her work on measuring housing insecurity and what we gain by examining fair housing through her conceptualization of housing insecurity. So before I turn over to Giselle, let me note just a couple of things about today's session. Closed captioning is available from the menu on your screen. You can use Zoom's Q&A function to ask questions, and we'll try to get to as many of these as possible. I apologize in advance if we don't get to all of them. We'll be posting a video of today's talk as well as Giselle's slides on our website. Look for these early next week. And finally, the format will be that Giselle will speak for about half an hour, then we'll take questions for about half an hour, and we'll wrap up no later than 1:15 p.m. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Giselle.
Great, thank you so much, Jen, and thank you to the Joint Center for having me. I'm very excited to be here and talk about my research. So I'm going to start my screen share to go through the presentation. All right. Let's close that out. Okay. All right, so I'm going to be talking about multidimensional housing insecurity, a new approach to measuring, understanding, and addressing problems among renters in the United States. And this is something I've been working on in a research capacity for several years. So let's start with talking about why housing insecurity is important. Particularly maintaining secure housing has been shown to be critical to health, mental health, financial security, food security, and child well-being. To just pull from some of the studies that have looked at these issues, respondents in one study who experienced homelessness and those who were behind on their mortgage or in foreclosure had a higher likelihood of reporting fair or poor self-rated health. Crowding has been associated with household food insecurity compared with securely housed households, as were multiple moves. And living in crowded conditions has had an independent negative effect on math and reading achievement among children and on external behavioral problems and physical health. And housing quality has been positively correlated with psychological well-being. So the problem is that insecure housing is widespread among renters in the United States. So we know from numbers before the pandemic that more than 20 million renter households are rent burdened, 2.7 million renter households live in crowded conditions, more than 830,000 renter households reported a threat of eviction in the past 3 months, and nearly 400,000 renter households lived in housing with severely inadequate physical conditions. So many aspects of renters' tenancies, such as unaffordability, physical conditions, crowding, and evictions, are examined with the intent of understanding precarious living situations, but they're often studied as standalone concepts. So even with some of the inconsistent definitions, we also know part of the problem is that inequities exist. So we know that forced moves, unaffordability, and homelessness have been shown to disproportionately impact Black households. Crowding has been shown to disproportionately impact Hispanic households, foreign-born households, and other older adults. And frequent and forced moves have been shown to disproportionately impact women, families with children, Black and Hispanic households, and young adults. So these limitations prevent a full understanding of housing insecurity among renters. So the primary questions that I aim to answer with this research are how widespread and severe is housing insecurity in all of its forms? And how do inequities manifest in experiences of housing insecurity? So these 2 questions are explored in the research that I'll present here. And we'll start with the first one, which is measuring housing insecurity. So what I set out to do is to understand if we could understand housing insecurity as a larger concept consisting of 4 identified dimensions that have previously been looked at quite extensively in the literature. So unaffordability, crowding, poor physical conditions, and forced moves. And as part of that question, we also need to look at how should we measure these concepts. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in the next slide, but in particular, if we think about combining these conditions into a larger concept around housing insecurity, we need to think about how they've been measured in the past. And there has been a lot of variation. So in particular, unaffordability has been measured by rent to income ratio, by housing induced poverty, residual income. It's also been measured as a subjective measure. Crowding, for example, has been measured by persons per room, square footage per person. Forced moves oftentimes are measured as a frequency measure of moving, or looking at formal evictions only. So these are some of the questions we have to consider, and some of the limitations of previous operationalizations. So for my research delving into these questions, I used the 2015 American Housing Survey. So this is research I did a few years ago. And this the sample that I used was a weighted sample of 18.8 million renters in 25 metropolitan areas across the US. And I used factor analysis to understand whether or not these concepts were related significantly in a way that would make sense for them to be measured as an index. So going into the first table here, and I'll be talking about a few things. So you'll see here the sample of 18.8 million renters that I pulled from the American Housing Survey. The different dimensions that I talked about: unaffordability, crowding, poor physical conditions, and forced moves. And so you'll see for each dimension, I used multiple variables as a way to operationalize each dimension. And I made the decisions to use these certain variables to address limitations where possible, and to align with common measures in cases where that made sense. So for example, you'll see here with unaffordability, I included 3 variables: whether or not the household was paying rent above 30% of their income, whether they were paying rent above 50% of their income, and whether or not they were living below 133% of the poverty level. And this one I actually only included if they had some experience of a rent burden. And I'll talk a little bit about this a little bit more about that in a minute. So for crowding, I used a couple different measures as well. So persons per room, which had been sort of a common measure of crowding and severe crowding: 1 person per room, 1.5 persons per room. But I also added an additional measure of whether or not there are subfamilies within the household, so more than 1 family within a unit. So for poor physical conditions, I used the American Housing Survey predefined adequacy variables, which combine a lot of different measures of inadequacy, including heating and plumbing, and to define both moderately and severely inadequate housing. But I also included a self-rated measure to get at some of the subjective understandings of people's experience of the conditions of their housing. And for forced moves, the American Housing Survey is somewhat limited in how they measure this. So the measure is forced to move by landlord, bank, government, or disaster. But I also added an additional measure for those folks who did experience a forced move if they rated their current home as worse than their previous. So indicating a forced move that put someone in a worse circumstance. So one thing I'll note here is that you'll see some of these variables here are not mutually exclusive, and they build upon each other. And so for the index measure, which I'm going to talk about more on the next slide, each variable received a value of 1. And so that's the reason why some of the variables are not mutually exclusive. So for example, for a person that is paying more than 50% of their income on rent, they would necessarily receive an index measure of 2 because they're paying more than 30% and more than 50%. And I did this because the index measure is meant to measure severity. And so we want the distribution of the measure in order to make sense, to measure at a higher level more severe manifestations of housing insecurity, and a lower level less severe manifestations of housing insecurity. So, and you'll see also in the previous graph as well that that housing affordability was one of the more common experiences of housing insecurity. But moving into how widespread and severe is housing insecurity when we think about it as an index measure. The factor analysis that I did do confirmed that housing insecurity is a larger latent concept that can be measured as one index of multiple variables across the 4 identified dimensions. So basically what that means, kind of more in lay terms, is that there's a high level of positive correlation within and across the dimensions. So these variables are highly correlated and they move in the same direction, meaning that people, if they experience one, probably more likely to experience another. And as I mentioned before, each variable given a value of 1, resulting in an index measure of severity. So there were 11 variables in total, but the observed range was 0 to 8. So what that means is that none of the households in this sample experienced 9, 10, or 11 measures, 9, 10, or 11 variables in total. So what we see here in the results is that 44% of renter households did not experience any indicators of housing insecurity. But on the other hand, 56%, so more than half, did experience some measure of housing insecurity. But you'll see here that there's a lot of variation in severity. So 19% of renter households only experienced 1 variable, 17% experienced 3. And a combined total of about 6.5% experienced 4 or more variables relating to housing insecurity. So you'll see, so that's, I thought, was an interesting result showing the variation in severity overall. But another thing I wanted to look at was the severity and the sort of nature of multidimensional housing insecurity. So I also broke down the index by dimension, so which you can see in table 3. So you can see that for households that did experience some type of insecurity, about 3.4 million, or 34%, experienced 1 variable and therefore 1-dimensional insecurity. So that might mean that person, that household pays more than 30% of their income on rent, but they're not below 133% of the federal poverty line. They do not experience crowding or haven't experienced a recent forced move and do not live in poor physical conditions. That would be 1 variable and by definition in 1 dimension. About 4.5 million households in this sample, so about 45% experienced a more severe form of 1-dimensional insecurity. So that would be 2 or more variables within 1 category. So that would be someone, for example, that lived in severely inadequate conditions, but they're not living in but they're not experiencing unaffordability or crowding or forced moves. But to me, one of the most interesting things that came out of this research was about 2 million households in this sample. About 20% of renters that experienced some type of insecurity experienced multivariable, multidimensional insecurity. So they experienced some combination of unaffordability, crowding, poor conditions, and forced moves. And this isn't included in the chart, but in the paper, it's of particular note. So of this 20.5% of households that have multidimensional insecurity, the vast majority, about 91%, experience a compounding dimension on top of unaffordability. So about 91% are experiencing unaffordability plus another dimension. So only 9% of these roughly 2 million households experience multidimensional housing insecurity without experiencing unaffordability. So those folks might be living in poor physical conditions and experience overcrowding, but not unaffordability. So you'll see here that the vast majority of households who are experiencing multidimensional insecurity have an experience with unaffordability. So given all of that information, what kind of nuanced insights does this research present to us? So really what this shows is that housing insecurity is widespread among renters in the United States, but it can manifest itself in a variety of ways, from mild to severe and through an array of combinations of the 4 identified dimensions. As I noted, unaffordability is the strongest standalone indicator of housing insecurity, but problems such as poor conditions, forced moves, and crowding contribute significant additional explanatory power for measuring overall housing insecurity. And what this means is that some households cannot make meaningful trade-offs between multiple undesirable circumstances because of extreme poverty, disability, discrimination, landlord decisions, or any number of other factors. And they, as a result, experience multiple problems simultaneously or cycle back and forth between a constrained set of options. So moving on now to part two of our question, how do inequities manifest in experiences of housing insecurity? This was something I looked at from the lens of fair housing. So as many of you who may be on this webinar know or have experience in the housing world, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 protected individuals from housing discrimination based on race, color, religion, and national origin. And then later amendments added protections to prohibit discrimination based on sex, disability, and familial status. But research on fair housing is primarily focused on access to housing in the renting or buying process, as well as residential segregation patterns. But analyses typically overlook how families and individuals can maintain stability once they actually secure housing. So one quote I thought sort of kind of presented this concept well by a very well-known housing researcher, Matt Desmond. He said in a paper, quote, "Owing to the frequency of eviction in the lives of poor families, as well as to the host of negative outcomes brought about by eviction, understanding who landlords put out is just as important as understanding who they let in." So here, thinking about eviction as one dimension of housing insecurity, but I want to look at housing insecurity overall. So housing insecurity in and of itself among renters, it's not explicitly considered within the language and context of the Fair Housing Act, but official justifications, rules, judicial interpretations have implied over the course of the many years that this act has been in place, that the act has a broad mandate to achieve equitable housing outcomes in many areas. And so my thesis for this research project was that renter insecurity must be considered an important evaluative component when examining the success of equitable housing outcomes that fair housing laws are meant to promote. So to that end, the research questions I asked here were, among populations protected under fair housing, are there inequities in the severity and experiences of renter housing insecurity by protected statuses? And do inequities that might exist, do they vary by dimensions of housing insecurity? So here I built on kind of my initial research, thinking about housing insecurity as a multidimensional phenomenon. And I assessed this question through a series of generalized linear regression models with a logit link function. And I ran this on a weighted sample of renters from the 2017 American Housing Survey. So I ran 5 models in total, 4 to predict housing insecurity as a function of fair housing protected status, for each of the binary dependent variables measuring housing insecurity, which I'll talk about in the next slide, and then the 5th model to understand multidimensional housing insecurity. So you'll see here a lot of information. I'm going to go through one line as an example. But these are the results of my regression analyses. These are all logistic regressions, meaning that each category, so measuring unaffordability, forced moves, crowding, poor physical conditions, was a yes/no question. Did the household experience any measure of unaffordability, any measure of crowding, any measure of poor physical conditions? And then also, did the household experience multidimensional housing insecurity? And so you'll see here, let's look at the highlighted line. So for households, and in these analysis, before I go into that, did control for college education as a measure of socioeconomic status, as well as whether or not the household had a subsidy, a housing subsidy, and for age. So for households with a disability, as an example, we can see here on this line, the numbers that are in parentheses are the odds ratios, which make the results much easier to interpret. And the results that have stars next to them are the ones that are statistically significant. So you'll see here for households that have a member with a disability are 43% more likely than households without a disability to experience unaffordability, 95% more likely to experience forced moves, 50% more likely to experience crowding, more than double as likely than a household without a disability to experience poor physical conditions, and again, more than twice as likely to experience multidimensional housing insecurity. And I highlight this line because this is One of the main takeaways from this research was how severe and how severe the inequities were, particularly among households living with a disability in their experiences of housing insecurity. But you can see for other groups as well, particularly for Black households, experiencing much greater likelihoods of unaffordability, crowding, poor physical conditions, and multidimensional housing insecurity as well. I also want to make sure that I state here that fully understand that identities and experiences of persons and households are far more varied and complex than can be summarized by just one categorical assignment. Experiences of housing insecurity among households who identify with more than one population protected under fair housing are not reflected in these analyses. And the reason for this limitation is to present an initial foundation for understanding population groups that are protected under the Fair Housing Act. But for certain, future research can and should examine the compounding factors of being both Black and female, of being Hispanic with children, being disabled and foreign born, along with any other multitude of other identities that are experienced by renters across the country. So the implications of this research are that overall, households that are historically and currently impacted by discrimination and most in need of protection by the Fair Housing Act experience severe and frequent manifestations of housing insecurity. In particular, the severity of inequities for households with a disabled member was particularly stark, and Black households experienced the worst outcomes among all racial and ethnic groups. The study confirmed the utility of measuring housing insecurity as a multidimensional phenomenon by establishing that inequities in housing insecurity can vary by dimension of housing insecurity and by multidimensional overall. And really taking away from this that achieving fair housing is not possible without considering housing insecurity in all of its complexity. In addition to spatial segregation and access to homeownership, these analyses support broadening the perspective of evaluating fair housing to include housing insecurity for renters. So returning to our initial questions that I presented at the beginning of the presentation, what I wanted to look at was how widespread and severe is housing insecurity in all of its forms, and how do inequities manifest in experiences of housing insecurity. And the results of my research confirm that housing insecurity should be approached as a multidimensional concept, which encompasses unaffordability, poor physical conditions, crowding, and forced moves. It's also more widespread when understood comprehensively. Notably, 20% of insecure renters experienced more than one of these dimensions simultaneously. And widespread inequities in experiences of housing insecurity exist among populations protected under the Fair Housing Act, lending credence to the argument that housing insecurity should be considered an important evaluative component for assessing the success of fair housing and promoting policies that work to reduce inequities. Wanted to include a list of references here when we share the slides in case folks want to look back on some of the sources that I cited. But I will stop share now because we can enter the question and answer portion. And I thank everyone for listening to my presentation.
Thank you, Giselle. That was great. Not the first time I've heard your research, but wonderful to have it presented to this audience today. We're getting some questions, and I want to, I guess, take a moment to start myself. While you have been pursuing your research, you've also been working full-time in advocacy and policy around homelessness. And I'm curious if you could share a little bit about how that's informed your perspective on the research, either the approach you've taken, the topics you've chosen to pursue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's something that as I was developing these research questions and thinking about how to approach them, is informed by the direct circumstances that I see in my work at the coalition, that my colleagues see when we talk to families who are becoming homeless. It's not uncommon for families to talk about both the inability to afford housing and also some terrible conditions that they lived in on top of that, or crowded conditions that they lived in as well. And so sort of seeing how extreme some of the manifestations of housing insecurity can be, I wanted to really go beyond just talking about unaffordability, which is obviously extremely important, but add in those other things to see, well, how often is it that someone is not only unable to afford their housing, but the housing that they are living in is really not meeting their needs or inappropriate for them, or really not the type of housing that they would even want to be in. So I think that's really important. And I think particularly as it relates to homelessness, we need to understand how many renters are in a position where they might end up homeless. And understanding the severity of insecurity that different households are experiencing can help us understand who's most at risk, where we need those resources to help prevent homelessness to go. So those are some of the ways that it's overlapped with my professional work as well.
Mm. And have you thought about using your index as a measure of predicting homelessness risk? Is that a sort of application that you see possible out of this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it's been really challenging. I think research overall predicting homelessness has been very challenging to pursue. But I think it would really require partnerships with state and local agencies who are running homeless systems, and who have information about the folks who are coming in, and how can we pair that information with what we might know about their housing circumstances prior to entering shelters. So that's something that I think would be really valuable for future research, definitely.
Yeah, great. We have a question that has come in about the geographic variation that you might have seen in the dimensions. And maybe this speaks a little bit more to your third paper, which you didn't talk about today, but can you say more about the extent to which these findings might vary by metro or location across the geography of a metropolitan area?
Definitely. And actually, I can share that as well. If in the first paper, I actually include an appendix for housing insecurity for the index by metropolitan statistical area. That's all of the areas that are included in that survey. And so if you look up that first paper, you will see the variation by metro area, which is another really interesting piece of the research in the sense that, for example, I'm looking at it now, Miami listed as the top in terms of having the greatest percentage of households with 3 or more indicators, whereas Seattle actually landed at the bottom with households for 3 or more indicators, ranging from 15% of households with 3 or more indicators to 32%. So there's quite a bit of range and a little bit of maybe some surprising results in terms of where you might think different cities might lie. And I think that's sort of ripe for additional research in terms of are there dimensions of insecurity that are more common in some areas and less common in others? And so if we actually include housing conditions, in addition to unaffordability, is that going to be bringing some of these other areas that we may not have considered as being, having a big problem with housing insecurity? But in fact, they do if we start to consider some of those other dimensions. And so that variation actually is published, and you can take a look at that table, and always open to ideas about why some of those variations exist. But it is very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of the audience is interested too, I think, in specific groups that you mentioned. And I'm just going to pick one that has had a few questions: the subsidized renters. A little bit about the differences that, or any surprises there in how they might have experienced dimensions of housing insecurity despite having a housing subsidy. Is this the group that might be affordably housed but have other conditions going on, that contribute to housing insecurity?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, because when we did some of the analyses, looking at both disparities and then looking at some of the structural predictors, having a voucher was a really great predictor for preventing unaffordability, and also had some decently strong evidence against protecting against forced moves. And So that's really important. And I think that sort of leads into some of the subsequent research I had done in my third paper and looking at the types of policies that might need to be implemented in order to address the different types of renter insecurity that people experience. And vouchers are really up there in terms of what's super important for addressing some portion of those. And particularly because unaffordability is one of the most common, as confirmed with this research, experiences of housing insecurity, that can go a long way in helping to make sure households are securely housed. But I also talk about the importance of adding in other policies that are going to help protect against forced moves, for example. And so making sure we have nationwide tenant protections and consistent tenant protections across localities, that's going to be super important for protecting against those types of issues, as well as overcrowding. And so, yeah, I think it needs to be considered as a major policy intervention to help us address some dimensions of housing insecurity along with other interventions.
Two methodological questions. One is about, can you talk about how you decided to weight the different components of the index and, whether you considered unequal weighting? And also a second question about whether there are any things that you wished you could have included in the index, but, the data did not allow.
Yeah. Those are great questions. So for the weighting, I talked this over quite a bit with a statistical advisor here, and we decided to weight each variable equally because sort of theoretically, there was no great basis for weighting them otherwise. We sort of could come up with a bunch of different scenarios in which say a person got a score of 1. You can imagine different scenarios where a household spends more than 30% of their income on rent, or a household has more than one person per room, but no other indicators, where that might be a manageable circumstance in which a household is living in. And so sort of we started thinking about, okay, well, we measure it as 1, we want to be able to understand the severity. And so adding that additional equal weight for each additional variable made the most sense to us without any additional research or research that we could point to that would indicate, this measure is more important than another. So we kind of theoretically were thinking, we don't know that, so we're going to weight it equally and see how this plays out. But that's a good question also for future research in terms of what's more important for developmental outcomes or for individual well-being. Is it affordability? Is it crowding? And so those are some of the things that that might be useful in terms of refining a measure of housing insecurity. And then what I would have hoped to include, I think, the American Housing Survey variable on forced moves is limited in that it combines a lot of reasons. Someone may have moved not of their own accord, kind of the most problematic one being a natural disaster, which may not indicate a household is insecurely housed, but experienced a disaster and then moved on to more secure housing after that. That's a limitation of that variable. I think also on the crowding side, in terms of measuring crowding, there's not a lot of great research that I'm aware of that really establishes a good baseline for what's the minimum square footage a person needs to thrive, like what's okay in terms of crowding, because certainly in some instances, people will choose to live with additional household members for positive reasons, for social supports. So those are some of the things we weren't able to parse out just because of limitations in the data, but things that I think are really interesting to think about moving forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. Right. That preferences play, a role there too, about how comfortable people are living in closer quarters. So absolutely. I want to turn to policy now, what the implications are. You talk about measuring and examining these different dimensions of housing insecurity separately. You also talk about the fact that we often address them via policy separately. So we have policies on housing quality. We have policies to support people facing unaffordability. So what is your big takeaway for, I mean, maybe we can ask it as a federal and then maybe more as a local, what are your takeaways for housing policy and for advocates who might be thinking, what do I do with this research?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of my main takeaways from this is if we start with the federal side, there's never been a comprehensive federal approach to advancing renter security. At various times throughout the course of how federal housing policy has evolved, there may be one issue that was of greater concern in that particular day, and that's changed over time. So for example, we think about kind of early mid 20th century housing policy focus on slum clearance and focus on housing quality, ostensibly to address poor conditions in housing, but it also ended up having negative effects in other areas of housing insecurity in that it displaced people, potentially forcing them into living into less affordable housing, still potentially with poor conditions. And so there were some unintended consequences, if you will, of just focusing on one issue in particular. And that's sort of been the trend, over the course of federal housing policy overall. And even if there's not unintended consequences, I think the second biggest takeaway for federal housing policy is that it's often been too small in scope to address the widespread nature of the problem. So if you take in particular talking about access to affordable housing, we have a limited number of housing vouchers that are not an entitlement yet, but something that we would hope in the near future could be made an entitlement. But the limited nature of that availability has made it such that a lot of households are excluded from being able to access assistance to address their unaffordability. And I think the same thing with housing development. We have public-private partnerships to develop housing with a low-income housing tax credit, for example, oftentimes not targeted to the lowest income households. And so those households are getting left out. And so we really have a piecemeal approach at the federal level that's not addressing all of these concerns. But interestingly, and maybe being overly optimistic here, that seems like we have real possibility in the federal conversation now, talking more about housing, talking more about the importance of Section 8 as an entitlement, and addressing affordability problems more broadly across a swath of renters in the United States. So that would be part one. And then part two of the question was there
more locally, what does that imply for a city trying to grapple with supporting renters facing housing insecurity?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that similarly, when cities and states think about addressing housing insecurity, the takeaway is that they need to be thinking about all of these things. But also, I think a challenge in particular has been that particularly with tenant protections, for example, something that's very almost exclusively implemented at a local or state level and not at a federal level. And so you have different tenant protections in different locations, which makes things much more complicated, but some renters are able to maintain their security because of where they live and others are not. And so trying to think about ways that local policies that have been successful can be expanded at the federal level is really important. So those are kind of some of the main takeaways that I had from delving into some of the housing policy and how we've approached it here in the U.S.
Right. I want to turn back to a couple of the more specific questions about populations within your research. So you talked a bit and you highlighted the findings on people with disabilities. Can you share with everyone how that a household with having a person with a disability is defined in AHS?
Yes. Let me just look that up. I don't want to get it wrong.
And one of the other questions is about your sort of physical versus cognitive. And I don't believe AHS covers cognitive disabilities, but I may be wrong.
Yeah, they have a relatively broad definition. that I'm hopefully almost at now. Here we go. It's fairly broad. And hold on. I guess, okay. It's measured by whether a member of the household experiences any one of 6 categories of disabilities that they define. So hearing, vision, mental, physical, what they describe as self-care, and what they describe as go outside home.
Okay.
So they have 6 categories of disabilities. Those are the ones they ask about for every member of the household.
And your research is looking at whether a household has any member with any of those disabilities.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. And there was a question earlier too about single women. And can you talk a little bit about what you found with relation to single women?
Yeah, absolutely. And so when looking at some of the disparities among populations protected by fair housing, I wanted to make sure that I was looking at populations that have traditionally experienced challenges in accessing housing or discrimination in accessing housing. And so in particular, I zeroed in on single female heads of household rather than just female heads of household. And that's sort of partly because of the way the data is structured, that when the interviews are being done, sometimes the head of household is categorized somewhat arbitrarily. So if you have a female head of household, that household might still have a second partner, and that household is going to, potentially be better off than a household that's headed by a single person, a single female. So I wanted to understand, of households that are headed by women, particularly single women, how is that going to be differing from jointly headed households and single male head of households? So that was sort of the impetus for looking at that category in particular, is to understand how, because the survey is measured at the household level, they're looking at the head of household. And so I want to understand in particular how that's impacting women, especially if we don't have another another adult member of the household in their family. And so that's where we see some of those disparities, particularly for those families that are headed by single women.
And switching gears a little bit from the occupants of a household to the structure, I wonder if there are differences in the experience of housing insecurity by the type of building that people are living in, which may have different kinds of landlords or different conditions. Is that something that you think could be woven into an index like this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it can be. I know the American Housing Survey does have quite a bit of detailed data about the types of housing that people live in, up to how many floors it has, how many units it has. So that could be something that could be really interesting to look at. I mean, I'm briefly reminded of, I think, a recent research report that came out of Boston, where they were looking at evictions and finding that the largest landlords that owned, 100 or more property, 100 or more units, were actually disproportionately evicting a lot more tenants than the smaller landlords in smaller buildings. So it has a real world implication for understanding, are these large buildings with maybe sort of less personal relationships between the landlords and the tenants, ripe for creating the circumstances where someone is not feeling securely housed or not experiencing secure housing.
Right. Yeah. I wanted to turn to, in the time we have left, although still please send in your questions. We still have time for questions. But to a question of my own about the fair housing policy. And, you have talked in your paper about sort of how the way people experience housing discrimination or discrimination in housing markets has evolved over time. And maybe our understanding and appreciation for what happens after someone acquires housing has changed too. I mean, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this. If we are shifting from once you have housing, it's a personal responsibility, to a greater appreciation of the many factors and influences that can make it really difficult to maintain that housing. So I'm just, if you could talk a little bit about sort of the sweep of history here and how you see our changing understanding of fair housing and where you'd like to see, it go next.
Yeah, and so I talk a little bit about this in the paper and sort of trying to argue for why it's important to think about housing insecurity with respect to fair housing. And I think it's because, primarily in the years leading up to and immediately following the passage of the Fair Housing Act, we had a much different housing market than we have today. And there were different circumstances that were kind of influencing the passage of that act and why it actually got passed. So at the time, there were increasing rates of home ownership, typically a more robust supply of rental housing in both city centers and suburban rings. And at the time, kind of a mass migration of white households to the suburbs. And over the several decades since the Fair Housing Act has been passed, housing market conditions have changed quite a bit. So now we have the cost of home ownership increasing quite substantially. As more people entering the renter market, the cost of renting also increasing substantially. And then you can also add sort of federal housing policy into this as well, with under Reagan, federal investment in low-income renter housing being decimated and like never coming back to the levels that it had been prior to that happening. And so sort of what I talk about a little bit is now presently, because of these sort of demographic trends and trends in the housing market, we have an increasingly tighter rental housing market, marked by low availability of low rent units, and weak income growth and soaring housing costs, both on the renter and homeownership side. And so we have different circumstances in place with respect to the housing market. And then since the passage of the act, we also have different manifestations of how discrimination is playing out, right? It's not going to much less likely to be direct discrimination, like, no, I'm not renting to you because of this protected class, but might be renting to you because your credit is too low, or because you have a history of an arrest or a criminal conviction, or because you were known to be homeless, any number of reasons that might screen out folks who are disproportionately people of color, disproportionately within the fair housing category groups. So that's sort of, in a very short nutshell, kind of what I aimed to lay out is that we are living in a different world. And so because we're living in a different world, we should be thinking about fair housing in a different way. And we should be expanding the ways in which we're applying the lens of evaluating it. So we can certainly still evaluate it as it relates to gaining access to home ownership. We can certainly still evaluate it as it relates to residential segregation patterns. But we have an increasing problem with housing insecurity in this country, and with people being able to afford housing, afford quality housing that meets their needs. And so we should add that in as a component when we're thinking about, are we meeting our goals of fair housing? And so that's really sort of the point I was trying to get at, and some of the historical trends that I wanted to go through to lay that out.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Well, I think maybe go back to one early question before we wrap up. I think the finding that, what we expect is that, and what you found is that affordability or lack of affordability is present in most cases of housing insecurity, but not in all. And I think that really is a surprising finding. And, do you have any more speculation about who those folks are who are facing housing insecurity, but not cost burdened?
I think that could use a little bit more delving into, to
Yeah.
be honest. It's a really good question. I would anticipate, maybe folks that are living in communities where housing, maybe disinvested communities where housing is not necessarily as expensive, but maybe very dilapidated. So that could be one instance in which you might see a number of households who are living in very poor conditions, as a measure of housing insecurity. But it's a good question. I think one that can be further broken down, perhaps by metropolitan area, to see, are there areas where conditions are the primary problem as opposed to affordability, or where crowding is a primary problem. And that I think can be looked at in much greater detail, because it is it's an interesting finding from the study.
Yeah, and I would imagine it'd be interesting too to look across a geography of a metropolitan area, the central city versus the suburbs versus the the lower density part, where those specific challenges arise, which is sort of a question, a related question that someone asked about the geographic variation and instability, and if it varies with housing costs or with even red or blue states, if you saw any of that in your findings.
Well, that's a good question. I didn't categorize localities by red and blue. I don't know the answer to that question, but it could be easily done with people of the metro areas and the different breakdowns of insecurity in those areas. So I mean, yeah, I think, some of the cities that we would anticipate would have a high level of insecurity are up there, right? We've got Miami, San Bernardino, Los Angeles, New York City. We also have Detroit as one of the cities that's experiencing the highest levels, one of the highest levels of housing insecurity. And again, that could be unaffordability related, but could also be conditions related, crowding related. And so those are things I think you'd want to parse out, because and then you have sort of San Francisco, again, which you would anticipate would be near the top, but when you include all of these dimensions, is sort of in the middle. That's a good question, actually. It's a good question that, I'm happy to continue to look at further, or if someone else wants to take that on.
Right.
That's a good something that can be answered, definitely.
And I guess one last question here. And it's something that the Joint Center has looked a lot at in terms of rental housing, and you are focusing on renters, that there's, a fair amount of renters live in single family homes, and we're seeing, the rise of investor owned single family homes, and wondering if you have any thoughts, maybe speculative, about the effects of that on housing insecurity, and maybe that's another dimension of the type of structure you live in, but
yeah, no, it's a good question that I don't know the answer to, but I think is related to the idea of doing an analysis of the housing insecurity measure sort of by the kind of household that the kind of housing that you're living in.
Right.
So going from single family up to multifamily, and that sort of might have implications for not only the landlord-tenant relationship, but the availability of housing stock in those various categories. And particularly the variation of availability in different areas. So that's something that you could look at with this and try to get an answer to that question. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think, Giselle, I want to thank you so much for joining us and sharing your work. This was really amazing. And we've had a lot of questions actually about where folks can find your work. I know we will post the webinar and the slides that you used today to our website in the next few days. Your paper and housing policy debate, we shared the link to that, but we can share that again. And I would say folks should be on the lookout for future publications from you. So thank you so much for being with us today. And thanks to everyone in the audience. This was our last biweekly research session of the semester. So we look forward to you joining us in the fall, and the summer. You can keep your eye out for an agenda for the fall. But in the meantime, in mid-June, we will be releasing this year's State of the Nation's Housing. So please be on the lookout for information about a release event about that. So thank you again, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.